Serial killers are killing out of a hunger to kill. They're not angry. They're killing because they have a compulsion. It's more similar to a drug addiction. Does a heroin addict choose or not choose to use the drug? No. They are powerless over the drug, and the drug controls them.
Addiction is essentially a hijacking of the brain's reward system and motivation systems. So any substance or behavior like drugs, alcohol, gambling, and even things like compulsive internet use or the use of our phones, they activate the dopaminic reward circuits in ways that are often more powerful than natural reinforcers like relationships. And over time, the brain can reorganize itself to try and prioritize that addictive behavior, even if that behavior starts to harm potential survival. And when it comes to human behavior more broadly, addiction can shape priorities, decision making, and impulse control is a really, really big one. That reward circuit can kind of override that natural tendency to control our impulses. And it often really narrows a person's behavioral repertoire. So instead of having this large repertoire of things that we do, our behaviors now are more geared towards just obtaining and maintaining that activity or substance, even if it's at the expense of our social bonds or even moral boundaries.
About 80% of all serial killers that I have studied, that I am aware of, fall into a category of either psychopath or sociopath. Now, of that 80%, more than half of those are psychopaths.
This tends to involve more affective and interpersonal traits like things like superficial charm, lack of empathy.
When they want something, they just do it. Nothing's going to stop them.
In this view, addiction is less central because when you look at the crimes of someone who we would consider a psychopath, they're very deliberate and strategic. So that's not the behavior of what we would expect from someone who is suffering with addiction.
They have no emotional connection or ability to feel remorse, pity, shame, guilt, or even fear, so that when they do kill, it's like water off a duck's back. It has no effect on them at all. Um, a smaller group, less than 50% of those who have this antisocial personality disorder, 80% of the serial killers, less than 50% would be sociopaths. And sociopaths are not born, they are made. They are a function of nurture, while psychopaths are a function of nature. And nurture is such that these individuals become conditioned or socialized, hence the term sociopath, into predatory behavior themselves, usually because they were victims of terrible abuse of all sorts themselves when they were young. And they become predators to protect themselves. And now, here's the interesting thing, back to addiction. Sociopaths, in my experience, those serial killers who are sociopaths are the ones who are most likely to abuse alcohol and drugs themselves. Why? Because they do have emotions. They are born with emotions. Their emotions may be distorted. They may be highly dysfunctional. They may be, seriously pathological. But they do have emotions that need to be numbed sometimes. And that's where the alcohol and drugs come in. Whereas a psychopath has no emotions to numb, and therefore the serial killers who are psychopaths are far less likely to abuse alcohol and drugs themselves.
For the research supporting sociopathy, it's typically used to describe individuals with more impulsivity, poor emotional regulation, and generally unstable lifestyles. And if you take that definition those cases, Substance abuse would be more frequently observed. So if you do take those definitions, individuals who are classed as a sociopath would more likely experience addiction and it would more likely escalate their violence.
A perfect example, Richard Ramirez, the infamous Night Stalker. In my mind, he was a classic sociopath. He was trained, he was conditioned into his predatory behavior. He was also a degenerate alcoholic and drug addict. And he was one of the few who I believe was actually very much impaired and high when he was committing his murders. And interestingly, after he was caught and he was given the death penalty, before the executioner caught up with him, he actually died on death row of cirrhosis of the liver from his combined effects of alcoholism and drug addiction. So it was actually his own addiction that ended up killing him. It's the sociopaths who are more likely to engage in drug and alcohol abuse, and you're more likely to find them in categories like the thrill killers.
Most scholars really argue that it's probably better to think of individuals on this continuum of traits from highly controlled and manipulative to highly impulsive. So you have highly controlled on one side and highly compulsive on one. And if we take that and you do accept the definitions of sociopathy, sociopathy would be the impulsive side, psychopathy, the more controlled side. Addiction tends to intersect more with impulsivity at that end of the spectrum. Serial killings involve often a lot of ritualization. Offenders return to the same methods, same victim types or patterns with this really rigid consistency. And that mirrors aspects of obsessive compulsive disorder. So, just as people with OCD have persistent intrusive thoughts, serial killers often describe those intrusive, violent fantasies. And I have done some research on individuals with homicidal ideation, which is where they have this deep desire to cause harm and kill, so much so that it is distressing. And it's not that they want to kill, it's that they have these impulsive, just intrusive desires to. And it creates really significant distress. And that largely mirrors the desire to conduct certain acts and behaviors that you see with OCD. So it's this compulsivity where it's acting on the urge. So, say it's the urge to flip a light switch or urge to clean, but in this case, the urge to commit a murder. And doing that act temporarily relieves that psychological tension. It's just obviously in the case of killings, it has much greater side effects. But again, it has this really ritual effect. So many offenders really do ritualize the crime scene too. The approach, the disposal process, even taking symbolic gestures and symbolic objects from the crime scene can mirror that of OCD. And the difference is the OCD is driven by anxiety reduction, whereas serial killing is driven by more gratification and dominance and fantasy fulfillment. So there are, very clear distinctions, but there are a lot of overlaps as well.
In your professional opinion, do you believe the actual act of serial killing falls under the category of addiction, or is it just classified under something else entirely?
No, I do not consider, I would not consider serial killing an addiction itself. But I believe that the analogy of addiction is very useful in understanding the progression, the escalation, the the effects of killing itself, the then momentary satisfaction and then escalation once again of the hunger. I think the whole pattern of addiction is a useful analogy in describing how serial killing works.
Serial killing shares features with addiction. The craving, escalation, loss of control is a really key one, but it and then compulsive repetition and tolerance, meaning that each time you do it, you need a little more. So needing more intense act. So each time you do it, maybe you get a little bit more violent, maybe you get a little bit more comfortable with the way that you're killing. So in that sense, many psychologists describe it as addiction-like. However, serial killing, I believe, is best classified under paraphilic disorders, compulsive violence, and then personality pathology rather than pure addiction. And I think addiction is a useful lens, but it doesn't capture the motivational complexity. So it's not about the substance itself, it's about the power, the fantasy, control, gratification, which is more aligned with compulsion and pathology than classic addiction. What I will say though is one of the reasons that I believe they are so closely related is a lot of the factors that create vulnerability for serial killings also create vulnerability for addiction. So the experience of childhood trauma we know is a very large vulnerability factor for addiction. Not having close relationships, experiencing neglect, abuse, anything like that, those really traumatic childhoods are then an indicator, a vulnerability factor for addiction. And then addiction can amplify those vulnerability factors and lead to increased likelihood of violence. So I would say that addiction can kind of be a stepping stone on the pathway to extreme violence, which is why I think they share a lot of commonalities. No, I think honestly, your questions were great. I think you've covered really good ground. I really liked that you focused on the OCD factor because I think that's often really overlooked, that it is often compulsive. And even with individuals who are extremely callous and they almost enjoy the kill because some do it and they don't necessarily get pleasure out of it. It's more about control. Even in those cases, there's still this like, I need to. It's that loss of impulse.